Thank you, Doug. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the National Archives for inviting me and holding this event. I'm going to talk about Douglas MacArthur, who served twice as Army Chief of Staff, received the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay, was one of the most decorated soldiers of World War I, won the Medal of Honor, was called a brilliant strategist by Winston Churchill, and is arguably the most disliked and even reviled figure in American military history. And there's the rub. There's the challenge for a biographer. How do you square the circle? How do you understand a man who is at one moment so disliked? And believe me, in talks I've given on MacArthur, I've actually been attacked on his record. How do you square the idea that this bombastic, egotistical, self-aggrandizing, prejudiced, narrow-minded man was also, I think, one of the most brilliant military leaders in our history? How do you do it? I come down to two words to explain this: Harry Truman. The President of the United States who relieved him, dismissed him, fired him, however you want to put it, who brought him back to the United States. He was a great hero, standing ovation in the US Congress, and then, as MacArthur himself would put it, faded away like every old soldier. In a recent internet and very unofficial opinion poll, MacArthur was listed as our worst military leader, ahead of, get this, Benedict Arnold, the traitor. So when I began this book, I had to try to figure out how to present these contradictions in a very complex character. And I decided to do it by doing what historians don't normally do. Instead of casting the man's shadow forward as to how we understand him now, I cast his shadow back. And if you cast MacArthur's shadow back, if you see him as he most recently was, as a humiliated commander relieved by the president in Korea, then you begin to look for all of the complaints about MacArthur that Truman found in his previous history. And if you look at any historical figure long enough, and if you look for the bad things in his character and in his career, you will find them. What if, I asked myself in writing this book, what if we were to look at MacArthur without that shadow of Korea? What if we were to look at MacArthur as having ended his career on board the USS Missouri, taking the Japanese surrender? What if Korea had not happened? How would we view him? And in shaping this outlook on MacArthur, I compared him with another president, not Harry Truman, and contrasted him with another president, not Harry Truman, but Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt and MacArthur were old political enemies. Roosevelt loved the Navy, grew up sailing. MacArthur hated the Navy. He didn't want to have anything to do with the Navy. Roosevelt was a progressive politician. MacArthur was most comfortable in the Hoover administration. Roosevelt shaped a policy approach to governing America that took into account those who had the least and needed the most help. MacArthur believed everyone could lift themselves up by their bootstraps. There were no two different men in American history that served at the same time, and yet, oddly and strangely, while they were political enemies, they became wary, but good friends. And Roosevelt decided when he became president, despite MacArthur's reputation, to keep MacArthur on as Army Chief of Staff. In my previous talk, I was walking up the aisle to give the talk. A man stopped me and said, "You know, I don't like MacArthur, but I really like your title. So I thought that I would explain then, as I'll explain to you now, where I got the title The Most Dangerous Man in America, as a way to explain the Roosevelt-MacArthur relationship. You remember in 1932, in the midst of a terrible depression, during the Hoover administration, a group of World War I veterans organized themselves nationally and came to Washington to lobby for the early payment of their World War I bonus, which was due in 1945. This was the bonus army. And they camped out in Anacostia and they lobbied the Congress, very peaceful. They set up a camp, they brought their families. These were the families that were the poorest of the poor. We have to remember the Great Depression. Unemployment was at 23%. MacArthur, Hoover was president, MacArthur was the Army Chief of Staff, and after several months of this campout, Hoover decided that the best thing to do would be to disperse, as quietly but as effectively as possible, the bonus army. And there had been some incidents with the bonus army and the Washington police. So the Secretary of War, Patrick Hurley, called MacArthur and said, why don't you get some troops together and escort this bonus army out of town? And it was a catastrophe. MacArthur returned to his quarters, put on a full dress uniform, went with his aide Dwight Eisenhower down to Anacostia, had clashes with the bonus army, and dispersed them violently. One child died in the melee, was asphyxiated, and MacArthur was roundly criticized for his actions, or as Dwight Eisenhower later said, I told that son of a bitch not to go down there. And when Roosevelt was nominated as president and returned to New York, the headlines at the end of July blared the news of what MacArthur had done. Now, Roosevelt, as nominee of the Democratic Party, had put together a group of people that at the time were called the Brains Trust, plural, but it became the Brain Trust. And one of the leading people of this was an economist by the name of Rexford Tugwell. I mean, look, if you want to study a great unknown American, read about the life of Rexford Tugwell. He's a Columbia economist, and when Roosevelt was running for the presidency, he went to Ray Moley, a close associate, and he said, we have 23% unemployment, no one knows what to do. I need to talk to somebody who will tell me why we're in the Great Depression. Ray Moley said, I've got just the answer. His name is Rexford Tugwell. Introduced him, economist at Columbia. And the day after the bonus march, Roosevelt was sitting with Rexford Tugwell in the governor's mansion in Albany. Roosevelt really liked Tugwell, just as a little footnote. When Roosevelt first sat with Tugwell, he said, can you tell me why we're in the Great Depression? Tugwell said, sure. You know, I'm not even sure now why we were in the Great Depression, but Tugwell knew. And Roosevelt said, what's the reason? He said, the farmers who are growing the wheat are standing in the bread lines. And Roosevelt thought for a minute, he said, yeah, that's true. Why is that? And Tugwell said, we're overproducing. The price of wheat is too low. That's why we're in the Great Depression. Roosevelt said, well, that's great. What do we do? And Tugwell said, price supports, which is where we get price supports. And Roosevelt, I mean, Tugwell was a genius. Roosevelt brought him into the administration when he became president. But on the day after the bonus march, he was sitting in the governor's mansion in Albany with Tugwell. When the phone rang, the butler took the call and said, Governor Roosevelt, Huey Long is on the line, wants to talk to you. The Louisiana demagogue who had helped Roosevelt get nominated. And Roosevelt rolled his eyes and said, all right, I'll take the call. He looked at Tugwell, who'd gotten up to leave the room. He said, no, stay here. He picked up the phone. He said, yes, Huey, how you doing? And Huey Long said, what do you mean, how am I doing? What the hell are you doing? You're the nominee of the Democratic Party. You're sitting up there in New York with all the fat cats, Phil Young and Bernard Baruch. You should be out there campaigning. Roosevelt said, no, Huey, everything will be okay. It's not time to stand up for the campaign yet. We have plenty of time to do this. We're going to need money. Money?